in the queue for that long. It's just a real shout out when you put the CIA guy on the hot seat for about 10 minutes as you wait for your webinar to start. So again, on that note, I'm Lindy Kaiser, Director of Content with Clearance Jobs. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar on the state of the security clearance process with Charles Phalen, former Acting Director of the Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency, also a 30-year CIA vet, spent a stint in the private sector. NBIB was the first director of the National Background Investigations Bureau. So a lot of the accomplishments that we talk about at Clearance Jobs in terms of the clearance process happened while Charlie was in charge of NBIB. So I always like to point that out and highlight that because I think that's a pretty significant thing and something he probably doesn't get his due credit for. Again, this is a white paper we're going to be talking about a little bit. You'll see a few slides interspersed that kind of go through some of the content that we did talk about in that white paper. And we also have squirrels today because this is something that Charlie and I have in common is an affinity for secret squirrel humor. So hopefully you are familiar with the beloved secret squirrel. You will see him on our slide deck today as well. So I'm going to start by just introducing the security clearance market realities that we deal with. We kind of put a lot of the problems that we have with the clearance process into these 5 buckets at Clearance Jobs. The one that affects the recruiting population specifically, and a lot of small businesses, large businesses, anybody that's hiring in the national security space, the government as well, is that the demand for talent simply outpaces the supply. We do not have enough cleared people to take all of the positions that are available. 2, clearance times are improving, but it can still take 300 days or more to get a clearance. So we talked, Charlie and I are going to talk later about the IC clearance processing times. A bit of a misnomer even in what they publish. A lot of the reality is the initiation stage. Investigations sit in the queue for a long time. Number 3, cleared job openings are at an all-time high. So we just simply have more job openings, more jobs out there. So again, we talk about the supply going down and then openings going up. Next, most talent is already employed. So again, we're all competing for these TS/SCI, DevOps engineers, a very niche purple squirrel. The only way to get those folks is by poaching. So we're not onboarding new talent at the level or with the skills that we need into government, and that's an issue. And then finally, reciprocity and transfer of trust is something that Charlie can really speak to well. Again, coming from the IC and NBIB and DCSA, that is really a big issue when it comes to personnel security, being able to move people within this cleared population. So on that note, nobody wants to hear me talk for that long. We all want to hear the delightful and incredible Charlie Phalen talk. So I want to bring the questions over to you. So you actually left DCSA March of 2020. So I don't know if that means really, did the world shut down because you were no longer in government anymore? I kind of want to know. So a lot of things have happened since then. You've had time to reflect. Kind of how do you see now that you're, a year and a half, beyond a year and a half out, kind of what scope do you give to personnel security clearance reform? What key things were accomplished in your tenure maybe, and what they're working on today? It's a completely broad question, Charlie. Thank you.
Okay, and we'll get to world peace right after that. Special guest will be some guy named Putin. So getting back to the March of 2020 piece, I did send a note out to my senior staff when I left, suggesting that, and this is now almost 2 years ago, as COVID was descending upon us, that this was and is going to continue to be a little bit like, or maybe a lot like that ride on Space Mountain down at Disney World, with all the banging and clanging, ups and downs, and spinning and twirling and mystery there. But that at the end of the ride, we'll come out in a good place. I just would rather the ride be a little shorter than it's been at this point. So anyway, so back to the NBIB piece, I would say the credit for bringing these times down, the investigation part of the times down, lies squarely in the hands of the several thousand people that have been doing this work. The field investigators, both the staff government employees and the contract providers, just could not have done a better job of finding the people to do it, bringing people in to get it going, and just really, really pushing for the better part of 4 years to get this to where it is right now. Without that cooperation and that level of effort from the whole process, this never would have gotten where it is right now. Yeah, some other things have been done to sweeten it up a little bit too, but it was that level of effort from those folks building up the capacity and getting the stuff done that made a huge difference here. So we're in a really good place, but not, even as I said before, and even I will say it now, not where it needs to be and where it can be, more importantly, because there's still some great opportunities to get this both faster, better, and maybe even cheaper if you can achieve all three of those things.
Well, maybe I think that's a good tie into talking about the workforce. So I think that's something that even came out. I didn't warn you to, I forgot that we were going to talk about the GAO report that just came out about the security clearances being on the high risk list. Mm-hmm. But they talk about the need as we kind of move to this continuous vetting model to evaluate the background investigator workforce. So you kind of tee to it there by kind of referencing that. I do think we underplay how important good investigators and adjudicators are to the process. Would you kind of agree with that GAO recommendation that DCSA needs to look at strategic workforce planning for that workforce, or how would you rate the health of the background investigator workforce maybe?
So a couple things. One is getting back to GAO and the high risk list designation. When you're sitting in a job in the government and somebody comes in like that and says you're high risk, that kind of sounds scary. But in reality, it is an understanding that there is some fragility in it. And it is also a recognition that breaking it is a really bad thing, and how important that process is to the ultimate determination of trust in the workforce and in and around the federal government. So that's important. One of the recommendations was about workforce planning, and this is not inconsequential. I would say planning in a couple of respects. One is getting a sufficient number of people in the right place to be able to do the work, because it is a cross-country operation. It's not just a bunch of people sitting in any particular city, particularly if you're doing an investigation on somebody who has been around more than just 18 years of their lives. Their life could take them across all sorts of time zones and states and everything else. So doing an investigation can cover a lot of territory. And I'll preface this a little bit by saying, yes, there's a lot of technology that can be used today to find out things, but there still has to be that human-to-human contact to get that full scope, to coin a phrase, full scope investigation complete with the information they need to get on it. The other things at GAO, so yes, they need to do that. The other challenge is that are there sufficient numbers of folks in the investigations business to do this? We saw badly back in 2015 what happens when there is a huge impact on that market. When the contract with USIS was not renegotiated or not renewed back in 2015, and that was the major supplier for OPM at the time for investigations. And putting it in context, OPM then and now our DCSA does about 95% of all the trust determination clearances in the federal government, both for national security and for public trust positions, on the order of about 2 million a year. And so when 60% of the workforce that was doing those field investigations almost evaporated overnight, you can imagine the impact on the process. And that's a huge supply chain problem, because a lot of those people didn't migrate. Most of them didn't migrate to other suppliers. They just disappeared. So that was the primary cause of the long-lasting backlog until the legacy contractors, suppliers in particular, and the government put their heads together and said, here's how we're going to rebuild that capacity, and got it back up to where it was, and frankly, even further larger. So that both of those are important. They did pick on 2 other things they wanted to look at. I know we'll talk about some of these later, but one of them is the Trusted Workforce 2.0, which I know you've got some slides I'll talk about, and they talk about how important it is to re-baseline and reevaluate what it means to be a trusted person somewhere in the early 21st century. And lastly, creating the IT infrastructure to support where this is going, because the IT infrastructure that has been working on it predates probably a lot of people in this room right now. It's pretty old. It has its roots back somewhere in the 90s, maybe the 80s. But
yeah, no, we talk about the IT piece of it, but it's not just an IT process. It's very much a personnel driven process. On that note, Sparky, the squirrel. So let's talk about a little bit about the overall clearance population. This is one of my favorite charts in our slide deck, and it's something that I've seen you speak to very well over the years, which is the total number of people that have an active federal security clearance. So at one point, this number was over 5.1 million. I mean, we literally had 1 million more people with security clearances. So some people might hear that and be concerned with that. There was a lot of news coverage. That was a nugget we put in our white paper. There's more cleared people in the US than the entire country of Norway. Well, Norway just does not have a lot of people living in it. Like, I just, like, some of the correlations just did not equate to me. So we had the desk audits, the reduction in the number of the cleared population. It made it really hard, especially for industry, to onboard enough people into the cleared population. And that's why we have this kind of hot competition for a small number of people. Now, you were kind of, leading NBIB a little bit post all of the desk audits and what was going on there, but were you still feeling the impacts of this? I feel like this is something I certainly heard congressional pushback about the number of clearances even when you were at the helm. So maybe can you speak to the number? And on that note too, if there are any other questions about the slides we're going through, about anything else, Charlie has said, ask me anything. It's almost like Reddit here. So if you have any questions about the security clearance personnel process, about the slides we're going over, anything else, drop it in the chat here. So type your questions in the chat function, folks, and we will be glad to answer them. If not now, later on. So again, on that note, the cleared population, have you experienced the impact of that 1 million reduction the same way we have maybe here at Clearance Jobs?
So interesting, over a period of time, I've experienced it from a couple of different angles here. So when that first started evaporating, and much of it followed the Ed Snowden espionage case and the private Manning espionage case, or whatever they want to call it, what private Manning did, and a rush to say we've got too many people that have clearances and maybe they don't need them. And there was a concerted effort to reduce the number of people who had clearances. Where I saw that most acutely was at my time at Northrop Grumman as the VP for Corporate Security. And we noticed that in virtually all aspects of the business, whether it was DoD, whether it was the intelligence community, or even some of the public trust activities that the company was doing, trying to get enough people in the door to be able to effectively do those contracts was a bit problematic because we were getting pushback. And where we saw it even more acutely was understanding that there are, back to your Sparky the welder on the previous slide there, Sparky's got a supervisor, and the supervisor ought to be a trusted person too, and the supervisor ought to be trusted. And so when you've got some of these oversight issues on the overhead things like your general counsel and that sort of stuff, they need to be trusted too. We had trouble getting enough people briefed in and cleared on programs that it was a lot of pressure not to brief people in and not to clear people. And that's where I sort of hit on the analogy of, and I'll go back to Sparky in just a minute, or maybe the earlier slide of the fighter pilot, whoever it is that Sparky the fighter pilot or whatever his name is, but
he's Top Nut. Does he have a name? Top Nut? Top Nut the squirrel.
Top Nut. Okay, so anyway, so going back to the welder, it is, do you really, if you're the guy that's piloting that boat that he's doing the welding on, do you really want to have less trust in the person who's doing that welding? Or would you like to have a basic amount of trust in that individual? Because there were some people saying, well, he's just doing welding. He doesn't need to be somebody you can trust. Well, yeah, maybe you do. They were back to the fighter pilot. Does he really want to say, I don't care who that person is that's working on the landing gear of my aircraft? I think the answer is we do want to trust those people.
Well, and to point out, I mean, there were the news articles going out saying like that there was at one point they were literally like trying to put like some of the big defense contractors were like cartoning off areas like within a ship or within a same manufacturing facility to separate cleared and uncleared. So you talk about that and it's like that just does not seem, if we literally have to physically drape technology within a system to try to keep, then it is probably much safer to ensure that everybody that's in that ecosystem has a basic level of trust or, the clearance required. And it's what you get. I mean, because we always have the pushback again, CIA guy, the top secret chef, or the food service or the government positions that support some of those cleared facilities. The clearances, no, not because, the sauce recipe is really secret there at the CIA. It's because that person is going to be privy to conversations just coming into the building, and you want to a basic level of trust for that person.
Yeah. And let me extend it even a little bit further, is because we go back to the sort of notion of what was the NBIB, not DCSA investigative coverage. It's not just people with national security clearances and access to the nuclear codes. It is people who are public trust in the suitability world, who are working for other parts of the federal government, either as staff or as contract people, or supplying things to them, that are equally as volatile and as vulnerable as what is a national security secret. And so, to take it to an extreme here, they do a public trust investigation on people working for the Department of Veterans Affairs. Why? Wouldn't you like to have a level of trust in the person that is working on your parent who's living in a Veterans Administration home somewhere? The answer is, of course you do. And so trust permeates the entire ecosystem of the government, not just national security stuff. And that's why, and we'll get to sort of your tier 1, 2, and 3 stuff a little bit, why there's an understanding, and as we move to the future of a trusted workforce, that there is a lot of similarities and a lot of blending amongst that whole population of people in the government where there is trust, whether it's national security or public trust.
Yeah, we had a question about kind of the breakdown of the cleared population, secret versus TS versus public trust. I don't think that they release in some capacity the breakdown of those numbers. So if you go to about.clearancejobs, we have something like the ODNI reporting on that. But that was something that we talked about in the earlier conversations. I think that sometimes people forget there's public trust, secret and top secret clearances. People fit into different buckets within that, public trust being different than the regular clearance population, but that's going to become a little bit more synergist maybe with the 135 model with Trusted Workforce 2.0. So I think there's a lot of pressure now around the TS-SCI population. Do you think reducing the investigative tiers will make it a little bit more easy for someone to move from a public trust into a secret or TS position, or maybe not?
I think it will, but not as instantly as it would be if I'm already top secret cleared and they want to move me from one program to another program. There still may be one more little thing they want to check out, but there's far more similarities in the questions that are being asked and the decision points being reached between a public trust and a national security determination, that it's a recognition that the processes are so similar. Why don't you just make it the same process for the collection of information? It's much of the same things to be considered in the adjudicative standards. And the answer is the answer. And except for perhaps foreign connections in the public trust area that are a little more fungible, the transition, all the work already done for a public trust clearance can transition over to a later determination on national security, and vice versa. If somebody's working in the security world, they're going to go work for Veterans Affairs or something, or some part in DHS that doesn't need national security. That's good. It makes it more fungible. It also makes it a little bit easier for the folks that are actually doing the collection and adjudication, because you've got more of a single stream at those 3 levels than you have today with 5 different levels of activity.
On that note, intrusion detection, our next scroll. Those images, just my PowerPoint skills, I'm just going to fill them with squirrel images next time. So this also relates to again, the hot topic at clearance jobs about how long it takes to obtain a security clearance. Dramatic improvement within this. I mean, we were at over 500 days for a TS clearance, just not that long ago. And the clearance processing times did improve during your tender at NBIB. You made process improvements specifically designed to make this process better. I think a lot of the process improvements designed to improve these processing times also made it a lot easier for cases to continue with COVID, because we saw maybe some some stalling in times, at least in some of our buckets where we weren't seeing some cases because there was something held up that they couldn't verify because of some COVID workforce issue. But for the most part, things moved along. And I think it was because, you had kind of identified a few of the wickets where there were stalls and were able to tighten a lot of those timelines already. So can you speak to that, how you identified ways to improve this process and why this is really critical that we improve these processing times?
So a couple of things with COVID, and is again focused on investigations and again the 95%, which is the today DCSA piece of it. What happens in the remaining 5% is a little bit more scattered, and I think it's mostly sitting on your right-hand side of your slides right there. One of the things that as we moved into the COVID world, and this was evolving before I left there and continued from that point on, is okay, 90% of a field investigation means you go out into the field and you start talking to people face to face. This is going to be really hard in a COVID world. And so even before the COVID set in, we found some ways to leverage technology and to use things not exactly like Zoom, but to use video teleconferencing capability to have interviews with people to discuss things that were maybe not quite so serious, or to get to the nub of some things, and have that one-on-one conversation that yesterday said we have to go to their house or go to their place of business to have that conversation. Now we can do it from our office into wherever the heck you are, and that saved both time, because that takes windshield time away from the investigator having to drive place to place to place, and the results are remarkably the same. And so this, what was a carve out to help us through the beginnings of the COVID, has now become more and more mainstream. It doesn't mean everything is going to happen on camera, but a lot more is going to be able to happen that way. And even to the point of picking up a telephone that's doing it as a voice from time to time solves that problem. Things that we had in the past had said, you got to be there in person to do it. And then adding some improving capability of getting to information that doesn't require a human touch. One of the longest poles in that tent was law enforcement data. Despite what you see on television, the ability of somebody just to click in and get every criminal record there is available on somebody for hiding in a basement somewhere in Washington, it just isn't that way. But a lot of improvement has been made on getting access to that information. A lot of cooperation from law enforcement. Certainly on the FBI side, they've always been cooperative with what they've got. But the local law enforcement stuff was a bit harder to get onto, but a lot of work done there. So that has done a lot to reduce that investigative time. The challenge still is on the front and back end of this thing. Again, during some of the COVID stuff, there was some delays in getting the investigation initiated from the point of a company, in the case of what your clientele, a company saying, I want to clear Bob, to a point where it gets to an investigative supplier to say, okay, we got to do an investigation on Bob. That time, in fact, if you look on the chart there, it's about the same, about a month or so through the initiation process today. 2 years ago, as a result of sort of pre-COVID stuff and some other financial issues that some of the agencies had, that time had actually been extended. And so what you thought was investigation time was actually stuff sitting in a holding pattern before it even got to the investigators. And so you had that added process right there. Other than an anomaly a couple of years ago, the adjudication time has been relatively stable. There was a problem, with as NBIB and early DCSA cleared out the investigative backlog, all of a sudden the adjudicators were inundated, but they got over that too, and got it back where it needs to be. So that's where the big improvements have been. What improvement we haven't seen yet is, again, I think we'll discuss a little bit later, is some of the forward-looking things in the Trusted Workforce 2.0 activity to rethink how investigation should be in the year 2022, and the biggest impact that the notion of continuous vetting will have on this business.
Yeah, and it's worth it. And I don't know if you know the answer to this. Somebody asked the question about SCI for TS clearances, like how long it takes to get an SCI on top of a TS clearance. That is a question that I get somewhat frequently, folks asking specifically about TS SCI eligibility and how that investigation process works. So I think there's a lot of confusion both for applicants and for industry sometimes on, if you find somebody, again, like on the clearance ecosystem that has a TS, are they automatically SCI eligible within the system? And if not, how long will it take to actually get that person into an SCI or SSBI program?
So the answer is sort of, it depends. So the investigative criteria and the adjudicative criteria for a TS clearance is the same for an SCI clearance. Where you run into some difficulty is in two areas. One is there anything in the, somebody's saying, okay, I want to take Charlie and put him in an SCI slot. Is there anything in his background that is particularly concerning to me for this particular SCI program, because SCI is not a general thing. It's SCI, you're cleared this program or that program or that program, kind of like the SAP world. And so there will be a little bit of a review to see if there's anything that's sort of an anomaly in the investigation. Like I have 15 cousins that live in, I don't know, pick your favorite country, Russia maybe. And so then there's that piece. The other piece is, depending on which SCI bracket you're going into, if it's an intelligence community bracket, there's some high likelihood they're going to want to have another conversation with you and a polygraph examiner. And so that can also add considerably to it, because the requirement for polygraph does not go away. There are not nearly enough polygraph examiners as they probably need right now for the kind of transitions that they need for both applicants and for transfers over. But they will put that off often. That will be one of the long poles in the tent to just simply going over the SCI. But if it's not a non-polygraph SCI program, as does exist within the Department of Defense, it should not take that long. But I don't have interesting enough, in my head, I don't have a number on what that part takes. I do know that oftentimes in the IC, though, it is, oh, you haven't done a polygraph yet? Well, we'll get you scheduled. Stand by.
Yeah. Well, on the polygraph, another question we got came about, would it be possible for your company to put you in for a CI poly, even if you only have a secret level clearance? My understanding is yes, polygraph isn't tied to you have to have a TS to go for a poly. It's tied to.
But the company can't unilaterally decide they want to put somebody in for polygraph. It's got to be the sponsoring government agency that says, okay, I want this person to have a polygraph. The same as much as companies would like to, and I understand the driving force behind it. I'd like to put a bunch of people in just to get cleared on speculation. And unless the government sponsors you, because the government's paying for these things, you're not going to get into that process. So it's the same with polygraph.
Yeah, no, I think it is always tied to the government need and the government requirement. So I think if a government agency is asking you for a CI for whatever reason, it's tied to the position, however that position was worked up. I haven't seen an example of a secret position requiring polygraph, but I'm sure, I mean, there might be some position out there that would need it.
Mostly in the intelligence community, but there are a few out there, yeah.
Yeah. So many questions about the polygraph in these. My favorite question that came in is why are the IC clearance processing times always so much higher?
Yeah, well, so one thing is the polygraph, because getting that scheduled is probably a longer pole in the tent, because of the number of I'm going to speculate here that in your earlier slide that there's a supply chain problem with qualified applicants coming in. Unless things have changed dramatically, the number of applicants who have some level of qualification who are trying to get into the intelligence community is still pretty high, and they still got to sort through a lot of people. So that's not, I don't think that's a problem that others have. That said, so the polygraph has a lot to do with that there is a more, in some cases, a more stringent or sort of a complicated or review process to even getting to the point of saying we want to hire that person. And it's a longer pole than it might be on some of the DoD things. But again, if it's a company, the company's already made the hiring decision. In fact, the company can't put somebody into that process until they have brought them on board. And so, yeah, the investigations are taking longer. There are not nearly as many of them to be done, but they don't have the infrastructure and the volume in some cases. And why, I'm looking at your chart here, why it is taking so much longer in adjudication has got to be, again, a byproduct of how many folks do they have in the headquarters area that are doing the adjudications. My theory has always been that just sitting on an adjudication, because it's a hard one, doesn't make it any easier in the long run. I don't think that's what's happening. I think it's just a sheer matter of volume of what's coming in and the level of the staff to do it. And to be honest, I think there's probably some HR stuff in that you don't see in those numbers.
Yeah. Another geospatial intelligence squirrel. So top issues causing clearance denial or revocation. I won't spend too much time on this because a lot of the questions coming in are a little bit more wonky on the polygraph and I want to get to continuous vetting and periodic reinvestigations because we had some questions on that. But this is always interesting and relevant, again, both to the FSO, recruiter and applicant side of things. What I always say is never weed yourself out of the process, as it were, because the whole person concept applies. Financial issues are always far and above the top reason for clearance denial and revocation. I've had OD&I push back and say before it's personal conduct for them, which might be true of IC cases per se. Personal conduct can almost always be layered over almost any other one. And notice even in these, there's generally multiple issues, multiple adjudicative categories are applied for the denials and revocations, but finances just always come up, frequently come up. OD&I has clarified that COVID-related financial issues, so if you can tie your issue directly back to COVID, but we've had a few interesting instances of that at clearance jobs. So someone's saying, hey, they didn't pay their student loans because of COVID, but the reality was they hadn't paid their student loans for like 10 years. So they couldn't use COVID as an excuse. So anything to speak to on the adjudicative guidelines? I know it's more OD&I than the work you were doing for DCSA.
This actually several things come to mind, not the least of which is I've gotten 3 phone calls today telling me my student loan has been forgiven. And so somebody's
congratulations.
So a couple of things. One is look at the sheer numbers here. The total of this is what, a couple of hundred, 300, 400, maybe 500 at the most of denials. This is coming from DCSA, these numbers, right? And DOD.
Yeah, this is specifically the Doha Industrial Security Clearance Denials and Revocations,
which is the final piece. Yeah. So when you think about the number of people that go through this process every year, and that the number that get denied ultimately is this number, that speaks to a couple of things. One is the process is not completely arbitrary, that there's a lot of thought that goes into it, because most people, the vast majority of people, get through it. And, it would matter to a few hundred that don't get through it, as opposed to the 2 million investigations that are done a year. You can do the math that's a small amount. The other thing you mentioned a second ago about personal conduct being a little bit higher of an issue with the IC, that's likely because they have a way of getting at you that the rest of them don't, which is the polygraph. A lot of stuff comes out on the polygraph that does not come out anyplace else. It's things that have been shielded from almost anybody's view, except for what the applicant themselves have done. So that's probably where you're going to find it higher there. Financial considerations, interestingly, we went through the same machinations back in 2008, when the economy was going badly and people were starting to have financial problems. And we took a very hard look at that. I was at CIA at the time, and said, the fact you have a financial problem is not disqualifying. The real question is, how did you deal with it? And how did you take that responsibility and take care of that responsibility? And understanding that sometimes it's not going to be as easy as just writing a check and getting it over with, but you've got this responsibility and obligation, how did you deal with it? Responsibly or irresponsibly? And that is really usually the determination as to why financial consideration will knock you out or not. Is did you try to do the right thing, excuse me, or did you just really do something really bad?
Well, we always say that sometimes hiring an organizer, a professional organizer, can save your clearance, because if you can show the paperwork, if you can demonstrate things, but sometimes if you don't advocate for yourself or don't provide the mitigating issues behind it and present something, things can look very different. Like, did you really have a layoff that caused this, and can you demonstrate times when you did pay your bills or you made attempts, versus just having kind of no clue how you got to where you are.
Right.
That becomes an issue.
That goes back to are you acting responsibly about it, or you just shrug your shoulders and say, I don't know what's going on here, I'm going bankrupt.
Yeah. You also can't blame somebody else. We see that come up sometimes. Like, even financial burdens become your burdens. National Squirrel Agency Lab says don't blame your.
Linda, can you get back 1 second to that chart here?
Yeah.
One other thing here. Maybe you can. There you go. You notice that again, that finance and personal conduct are the 2 biggest ones. Criminal conduct comes into it. What is truly interesting there is psychological conditions. That there's this urban legend that if I have gone to see a shrink, that I'm not going to be denied a clearance. Clearly, that's not true. When there's this small number of people that are being denied a clearance because of some psychological condition, usually it is in the extreme when it gets to that point. In fact, a key mitigator is, yes, I'm getting treatment. Okay, good. That's the
the best thing you can do is actually see a mental health professional. I mean, that's what we see. The denials and revocations are generally based on untreated mental illness,
right,
not
exactly.
on someone who is taking proactive steps. It's someone who the self, I treated myself, or again, and it comes out another, that's where I think sometimes you see, potentially an alcohol consumption adjudicated guideline come out. Somebody has another underlying issue and they're not taking care of it, and then it manifests in other issues. But someone who is proactively seeking mental health treatment, I mean, even psychological conditions, and they did a lot to clarify that by tightening up question 21. So should make it a lot, a safer space for people. Since we're lingering on the slide, we might as well talk about drugs now. Nobody has asked about it yet because clearly no one wants to be the person. They think the CIA is watching their messages here. They don't want to be the person that asked about drug use. But ODNI released its kind of guidance on the adjudicative guidelines. No changes to the adjudicative guideline. Obviously, drug use, illegal drug use, still an issue for security clearance holders, but they're trying to make it easier on the front end, the application piece, saying when you need to abstain, being pretty direct about saying for ODNI, they expect it to be when you sign the SF-86. Obviously, there's still a lot of freedom around suitability guidelines for how agencies will actually interpret that or what they'll do, right. But they're trying to make it pretty clear that for what they're telling folks to do, don't do drugs past, after you've signed the SF-86. And then CBD products, hardy buyer beware, and then investing in, drug businesses. Any thoughts on those changes?
So I think they're long overdue for a number of reasons. The practical reasons being the biggest ones. I think particularly as more and more states have said marijuana is okay, it's legal, you can do it, and different states have different thresholds of what it is you can do. Can you buy it? Can you sell it? Can you smoke it? Can you pass it to your friend? Whatever. And but it's legal as opposed to what it was when I was entering this business, which is strictly, completely illegal under all circumstances. And so this is a recognition that there are people that will be qualified candidates to do work on behalf of the government, either as employers or contractors, that will have legally used this stuff and have been legally using this stuff in some states for some period of time now. And is it really fair to deny them that? But it's also recognition that the federal law says this is not legal. You can't do this. And so the commitment it has always been and continues to be, once you signed on board, or in this case, once you filled out SF-86, stop. You can't use this anymore, period, until the federal government laws change. The interesting challenge on this is going to be reaching backwards is how far back will they accept my usage if I'm in a state that still says it's not necessarily legal. And the gist of, I don't have it in front of me right now, but the gist of the ODNI thing was be lenient. A few months is probably okay, unless they are a habitual user of it, to extremes. So that goes back to the sort of recency and frequency tests that a lot of agencies have used. The other challenge is going to be, will different agencies have different ideas about what that threshold is? And I can envision in my mind, with no insider information on this right now, that DEA is going to have a stricter threshold of pain than, say, CIA is going to have, or FBI might have something in between those sorts of things. And so that will have to be something people work out. But it's still, I think, it's opening the door for a lot more reasonable approach to how to deal with pre-employment drug usage. Particularly for people that are sort of coming into the workforce for the first time here. And I guess this is the point, you and I, Lindy, we talked offline last week or earlier this week about something out there in Google land. If you Google it, is the marijuana bugaboo, which is an article written back in the either late 30s, early 40s by the editor of the medical journal for the U.S. Army, who is basically, I think it's late 30s, basically saying this whole notion of beating people up for using marijuana is crazy. There's nothing wrong with doing it. This should be decriminalized and legalized. And the reason I bring that up, aside from this is not a new, this is like a 90-year-old document, an 80-year-old document, I don't know. The author of that document is my grandfather's brother, Dr. James Phalen, who was an Army doctor in World War I, as was my grandfather, and went on to stay in the Army and became the editor of this journal. But it's an interesting short piece saying, really, this is dumb, guys. Don't do this. But nobody.
And they still let you work for the CIA, so you did fine. So it's okay to have some, you know.
Well, even better, my dad worked for the CIA, so they let him in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think as you see, but what I appreciate about the memo coming out from ODNI is they're always going to get criticism that they're not being, you know, progressive enough or forward enough, and you know, there's probably something to that. But at least kind of putting something out there is better than we've had kind of this speculative state over the past couple of years about it, and they're showing an inclination towards this. But I get until federal law changes, I mean, they have a pretty good posture to say, like, I mean, as an agency, I mean, I found it ironic some of the pushback they got that why didn't they go further, and I'm like, well. I mean, Congress probably needs to change something. Something needs to change. You're probably pushing back at the wrong place. You don't want your security clearance, you know, national security workforce to be leading the charge on some of these issues. That really, you need to, you know, put your policy beef somewhere else. We've gotten a couple questions about dual citizenship, so I just want to address them here, because that policy change might have come out. I don't know where you were at when that came out, but we did have for a long time, you know, if you're a dual citizen, you had to turn in your passport, all of that kind of, those requirements changed. So we do get questions, if you're a dual citizen, is that automatic security clearance disqualifier? No, because, you know, some countries automatically make you a citizen based on criteria. So it's not even an issue of, sometimes an individual hasn't even applied for citizenship somewhere else. It's going to be very individual driven. But do you have any other thoughts on dual citizenship or foreign influence issues?
So a couple of things. One is going back to your point about changing the rules for turning in your passports and that sort of stuff. The rule was before, if I was whatever country A dual citizen, that if I got if I wanted to get my clearance, I had to go down to country A's embassy and turn in my passport, which is the surest way of saying, hey, Charlie just joined the CIA. You may want to watch him a little bit here. So I think they finally realized this is an OPSEC problem to no end. It is still inappropriate to use that passport to travel if you've got the clearance, that foreign passport. But it is not saying you have to turn it in any way, shape, or form. And to your point, it is not an automatic disqualifier unless you are a dual citizen of a short list of countries. You can guess which ones they are. Excuse me. But you know, certainly for the Five Eyes countries and NATO countries and a lot of the other countries we have good relationships with, and neutral countries, having dual citizenship is not an automatic disqualifier. Your level of engagement with that other country, though, will, to the amount that you are beholden to them in any way, shape, or form, is something that is useful to understand. And adjudicators will have to look at that and see exactly what you're you may have to go on mute for a second and cough. Hang on 1 second.
Yeah. And so, can I move on to our next question, which is a good one. Somebody asked, give an example of the sexual behavior. What might be a cause of clearance denial under the sexual behavior adjudicative guideline? I have several examples from our reading of Doha cases, but Charlie, I'll let you start. Do you have any examples within your wheelhouse of what would cause? Because I think we always get it. Well, wouldn't that be criminal conduct? But I have seen instances where something was based on the sexual behavior adjudicative guidelines specifically and not criminal.
I think things that are certainly criminal stuff. Certainly, if it's a rape, assault, this kind of a thing, that's a problem. Good news is that the things that 30 years ago would keep you out, like you know, your sexual orientation or sexual affiliations, that doesn't count anymore. Nobody really cares. The sexual behavior stuff that I'm probably not the best at adjudicating the adjudicative guidelines, but stuff that would be if because of your sexual behaviors you have put yourself in a position where you can now be or are being exploited to do bad things, whether it's illegal or criminal or just unethical, that would be a challenge. And it's not because of that, it's because you are embarrassed about, and this was one of the arguments about if you were gay or not. that's who cares about that anymore. But if you're doing things that are going to put you in a position where you can be exploited, then that is something to consider, and how can you deal with that? But as you'll see in the numbers, that these kind of things are, it's a minimal number of people that run into something that is this difficult. By and large, it is things that are or borderline on criminal activities.
Yeah, I was like, yeah, it could be considered. I've seen it in the example of things that were not criminally prosecuted, but clearly were inappropriate. So, you know, even like inappropriate workplace conduct or things like that fall under that maybe, again, it usually, like almost all of these things, multiple issues are at play. It usually falls directly alongside another issue. Charlie, I could talk to you forever, but I think we only have, praise the Lord, one slide left because we're getting towards the end of our time. I have been answering our questions as we go, so hopefully if you had a question, you've gotten it close to answered. We will continue to take questions, so if you have things, I will follow up after the fact. You can certainly find my email address out there and reach out if there's other questions that we didn't get to. But I think most of the questions we haven't addressed so far have come down to Trusted Workforce 2.0. And the changes here, I specifically kind of am highlighting the 135 framework because I think that encapsulates what we're doing. It has the continuous vetting piece on it, the reduction to 3 investigative tiers. And this is really what we're seeing as the future of personnel security today. So I kind of wanted to end by talking about the 2 pieces of that: continuous vetting. We did get a question on there about, hey, periodic reinvestigations. Will I still be asked to do a periodic reinvestigation? Answer, maybe. Probably if you're in the IC, because they're not super streamlined about what they're doing for continuous vetting yet. And then, yeah, talking about the National Background Investigation Services, and a little bit about how the IT piece of it is going to frame all this. So can you talk a little bit to Trusted Workforce 2.0?
Sure. And so, whoops, you went off the slide. There we go. Thank you. The fundamental change in this thing, or notice in this thing, is that trust is trust is trust, and stop worrying about whether it's going this way or that way. But understanding that there are still degrees of trust. Is there the ultimate trust? So if you're coming in the door and we're going to let you do some stuff in the background and in the middle, so it's tiers 1, 2, and 3 as opposed to 1 through 5, which would then flay off into this either suitability or national security stuff. That's recognition that the 1, 2, and 3 levels across that board are looking pretty similar now. So I'm thinking about sort of your population of folks that you work with the most here. The first contact with this is going to be initial vetting. Don't expect that to be a whole lot less robust than it is right now, because typically people coming in for the first time into this, we still don't know enough about it. We got to do a really robust plan to make sure that initial trust is worth it. So that'll still be a little bit complicated. It'll still take a little more time. There are no magic bullets that will get us through all this and say, just run a credit check and you got the answer. There's some who believe that. I do not, and I don't think that's where this is going. The place that's going to be the biggest change in this is continuous vetting, and that is the notion that every 5 years or every 10 years checking on somebody to see if they're still trustworthy. The fact that it's being rechecked absolutely makes sense. The fact it was 5 or 10 years is built on where technology and people were back in the 1940s and 1950s. Now we can do it a little bit differently. And the notion here is that an aperiodic check. It is essentially a continuous collection of information that is being pushed from relevant sources, whether it's law enforcement, whether it's intelligence records, agency-specific records, pushed into a framework that will allow an agency or in your companies, because the companies that are doing classified work have to have their own insider threat detection programs, where they can monitor where things are going with somebody's development. It's a recognition that people who are going to betray a trust, the ultimate trust betrayal, whether walking off with a secret formula for Coke or whether it's walking off with the big secrets, it's not something that just happens overnight. People devolve over time, and paying attention to that devolution and seeing it start to devolve earlier will allow an organization to intervene, either get the person back on the right track if there is something that is fixable with it. And I've seen examples of that actually working, which is really good. Or because it's so challenges and judgments they've made that are not good. Or determining that this is just too hard and it's probably time to offboard this person and move on to something else here. It's also a recognition that there are evil people in the world, but there are far more people that are careless and not paying much attention to what has to happen. But the things that they can do and put your information at risk are just as dangerous. Because once it's out there, and it doesn't matter whether private man took it out because wanted to share it with because he actually felt that way about the providence of what was happening, or whether he was just trying to make a point. Either way, it was a bad thing. So this is going to be aperiodic. It's up to an agency or a company to deal with this stuff. It will actually be more work for an agency and a company, but it will take less work, less resources from the initial vetting program. They're now being diverted from initial vetting to do periodic reinvestigations and put them back in the initial piece. To the question about will I ever get periodic reinvestigated again, the answer is yes, for a period of time for sure. Because a lot of the IC agencies they still want to do this until they're comfortable, and I'm okay with that for a while. But they aren't going to be doing it for everybody. It will be more aperiodic, I think. The other piece is that those that use a polygraph are still going to want to do that from time to time. And they can't do that continuously. And then another two more places that I think your clientele is going to see a lot of this is when this works out and when this is fully articulated, the idea of crossovers, of transfer of trust, moving from program A to program B to program C will be a lot better. And although it's not as bad as a lot of people would believe it might be right now, I would say probably the reason that it gets a lot of attention is because there's one of those unwritten rules that the probability of somebody being delayed in a crossover is directly proportional to the rank and importance to the company that they're trying to cross them over to. And so that gets the attention. And all the other thousands of people get crossed over pretty quickly, it just doesn't get that level of attention. It's still not where it needs to be, but it is still a whole lot better than it was. And then again, if somebody leaves the government for a while or leaves the industry and comes back 6 months later, this will allow it to be brought back in a lot quicker here. One of the places that your clientele, anybody getting into this, is going to touch that instantly is when I'm put in for my initial investigation or for my reinvestigation or for something is EAPP, which is a sub part of the larger NBIS, National Background Investigation Services. I did discover a document the other day that said EAPP was actually under consideration, the replacement of EAPP, which I have gone out in public and said when I was in both the DCSA and the NBMB job, it'll be ready by 2018, is that people were considering putting this in place as early as 2009. And it's been doing around because the EAPP, although EAPP's not a bad thing, EAPP is really kludgy. EAPP will be a lot better, but it's not out there completely right now. It's part of the larger development of this NBIS piece. NBIS started as just simply replace the old and maybe compromised OPM case management system. And that's what it was designed to do initially. But as time evolved and Trusted Workforce 2.0 started to surface, and that postdates the beginnings of NBIS, and a recognition that this IT background is going to have to support a much broader approach to this process, it has been delayed, and it's probably still a couple of years from full articulation. So key thing will be for agencies and even more importantly for companies to be able to get into this new data system and be able to use it and use it to their advantage. But back to that first point of contact, EAPP, which is in very limited use right now, but I expect in the not too distant future it will sort of skyrocket out there and be the initial point of contact for people, and they'll find it a whole lot easier.
Yeah, no, they've been touting EAPP for a long time. And again, I've been kind of waiting for like, when are the floodgates going to open? But I think we've seen it with the issue with getting NBIS on board. And that was also in the GAO report. You know, we've kind of had these timelines. They pushed them back. I know that's something DCSA has said, hey, like we want to we want to go when it's ready to go and not just have like a benchmark based, system. But in pushing that back, it's obviously taken some time to get EAPP on board as well.
Well, and so keep in mind that NBIS is a centralized activity, but it is touching 105 federal agencies, all of which have their own inside infrastructure, and it has to be able to be compatible with all of that as well. So it's just not quite a plug and play, get your Outlook 365 kind of thing.
Nothing is plug and play in the government. Is anybody who's like tried to work on Windows XP or whatever on their government
Right.
device can relate. Well, you got the rest question. I know the reciprocity piece. I mean, it's a question that comes up. We've had a few threads about that. Like, hey, why do I have simultaneous investigations going on with the IC and another agency? I don't, we still have two different systems, scattered castles and, DIS. I don't think we're going to ever, I don't know. I mean, I don't think we're ever going to be perfectly streamlined. I think we'll see improvements. I think within DCSA, especially like the reciprocity piece, I mean, they've touted it's now 5 days, they say, but I would say that's 5 days to get in from somewhere else. And depending on where you're benchmarking that date, obviously, right. But it means like once they have received it, it's probably been delayed a few other places, but once it gets to the right person, they can approve that reciprocity request in 5 days. You're never going to see the similar thing going into the IC. And that's, I mean, in large part due to polygraph, but not just polygraph, the investigative requirements of how they move people in is just a lot. I mean, and they'll never share their processing times anyway, will they? So we won't know the the reciprocity timelines.
Yeah. So the notion of 2 investigations going at one time strikes me. I don't know what this person's what the background is on it right now, but it strikes me that they're trying to get into 2 different contracts or 2 different agencies at the same time. So if I'm trying to get into DoD and trying to get into CIA or an NSA, they're going to run parallel investigations. It's just the way it is right now. Where it will have a where some of this trusted warfare stuff will come and have a greater impact is once I'm in the door and I need to cross that threshold, it'll be a lot easier now. Because a lot of these in the past, a lot of agencies have still said, yeah, you're cleared TSSCI over here, but I want to do a whole new investigation. And it's happened. This should reduce the amount of time that takes and reduce the number of instances where that particular thing occurs. If a polygraph is missing, yeah, they'll want to do that.
Yeah. Well, I think where you should see, hopefully, that, the transfer of trust, reciprocity should get a lot better is within a lot of those agencies that are still within the DCSA ecosystem, because they are conducting investigations for a number of agencies as well. So I think when you have an investigation that's all coming from one centralized facility, that's where, I mean, that reciprocity piece should still be easier within that ecosystem, especially when NBIS is up and running. We are the only people that could talk about these topics for an hour and still have more to say, but we're getting to like the end of our time. Is there anything else we haven't talked about that you wanted to touch on?
I don't think so. I think we can talk about squirrels another time here, but I do appreciate the opportunity to get to talk to folks and give them a sense of what's happening and put some reality around some of the things, some of the urban legends that are out there about how things are happening. So this is a good venue. I appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation.
Again, I cannot believe we literally, I thought, oh, there's no way we're going to talk for an hour. That might be too long for a webinar about security clearances, but I talked so long, I'm going to owe you some whiskey to help with your voice after having to talk to me for so long. I appreciate the time. Again, we've seen so many improvements in personnel security. I hope you will check out, download our new white paper. We'll send out the link to everyone here. And again, it's just been, you're always a wealth of knowledge. I always appreciated watching you on C-SPAN for your congressional testimony. And now hopefully this is a little bit more of a relaxed environment now watching you talk to our audience at clearancejobs.com. So I so appreciate it. Thank you so much, Charles.
Okay, Lindy. Take care. Bye, everybody.